Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 7, and this lesson we're going to be covering ASP.NET Core MVC project types. So MVC is a lot like Razor Pages. So we'll see the differences and the similarities as well. So a lot of maybe if you're new to HTML and CSS, a lot of that new stuff is just the same here. So we won't have to double cover that. So it should be a little bit shorter of a lesson than the last one, on Razor Pages at least. Okay, so let's go down, create a new project, a ASP.NET Core web application. We want to call this the MVC message wall. And MVC message wall app, and hit create. And here we get our same screen for any web app. Notice that when I first select web app, I don't get a choice of what type of web app I want, and that's because it's a web app. And from there, they want to allow us to select what type it could be. So for example, we could do the Razor Pages right here, but we're going to go down one further. It's a little touchy here. One further and go with Web Application Model View Controller, or MVC. The rest of the options will leave the same, so .NET Core, ASP.NET Core 3.0, and we're going to configure HTTPS, but no authentication and no Docker support. We hit create, and it looks really similar to what we had with Razor Pages. We get this first page that's exactly the same. It's just about ASP.NET Core in general. We can close that out. And we have our dependencies. We have our www root folder, which has what looks like the same exact stuff in it. In fact, it is the same exact stuff. These are all the same exact static files we saw in our Razor Pages demo. So we'll skip over those. App settings has the same logging configuration and the fact that it allows all hosts. Program.cs is exactly the same as well. Startup is a couple of tweaks here. Instead of services adding Razor Pages, we're adding controllers with views, otherwise known as MVC. Otherwise, this is the same stuff. Okay? The one thing that is a little tweak here is we were using in Razor Pages, we were using Razor Pages routing. But in MVC, we have more customized routing. So with Razor Pages, the routing is based upon your relationship to that Pages folder. So if you're in the root, then your route is the root, and it's at the root, and your name is whatever name you gave it. At least that's the default you set up, or that is set up for you, and you can modify it from there. But it's a pretty simple routing scheme. With MVC, we have a little bit more advanced routing capabilities. And you can mix and match MVC and Razor Pages routing. That is a possibility. This is how MVC sets up routing by default. So we map a route, and this is the default route. You can add one before this if you like, so that if it matches the other route, it will map that way. If it doesn't match the other route, it falls back to the default. The default is that the pattern is controller name / action name, and then potentially an ID afterwards. So the controller name, we'll get to what controllers are, but in Model View Controller, they're essentially you could think of it as a code behind, very similar concept. And it also has this equals home, which means if you don't specify a controller, it's going to assume you mean the home controller. And you can change that if you want to. The action is which action it's taking. You have multiple actions inside of a controller, potentially. And so in this case, it's going to say, well, the default action is the index action, which is kind of like the main entry point, the getter for a specific page. And then you have this ID question mark, which that means it's optional or nullable, and it's If you have a specific ID you want to pass in, you pass it in that way. Otherwise, you don't pass anything in. So we'll see that in a minute on how that might work. But this is the default mapping for routing inside of MVC. In general, you won't change this. The only time you might change this is if you wanted to add something specific. For example, APIs sometimes, and if you're not familiar with APIs, that's an application programming interface. That'll be in 2 lessons from now where we get introduced to APIs. But an API typically has a route of /API/controller action ID. And so you'd have something similar to this, but it'd be up top, and you'd have, maybe call it API routing, and look like this. So if you had a call to something that started with API, it would know to use that routing first instead of your default routing. So that's a possibility. I'll undo all of that. That's a As far as naming goes, this is the convention, and it does matter that you call them controllers, models, and views, these folders. That's why they come by default. So if the code finds a home controller and it looks for inside here, we'll look at the index action and it says return view. How does it know which view? We'll go over this more in just a minute. But how does it know which view? Well, it knows to look in the views folder for the home folder, which corresponds to the home controller, and inside there is an index view. So that's how it links those two up. And so yes, the naming is important, the way it's named. Okay, so let's start with the controller first, because that's the most important piece of this. I call it the code behind. It's a little bit different than that, but that's the easy way. Then down here we have index, privacy, and error. And these are 3 different actions, they're called. So a controller has actions, and each action corresponds to a view. Now remember that the route for MVC is controller/action/ID if there is one. So the controller in this case would be the home controller, and we drop off controller. So it's intentionally named controller at the end. So that's important to name it controller. But the first part is the controller name that we call it. So this would be the /home, that's the controller, let's say index, which actually is the default route as well. So if you call /home/index, you're going to get the index view. And this is the code that runs to actually generate or give us the view. And it just says return view, which means it's going to go down to the views folder, home, and load up this index page, which has a little bit of Razor syntax for the title. And then it has a little bit of HTML code that says welcome and learn about building web apps with ASP.NET Core, which just so happens to be the exact same text as a Razor Pages app. And if you look at this, you probably think, wait, this looks familiar. There's not enough HTML code there. There's probably some kind of wrapper, and it's probably in the shared folder, and it's probably called _layout. And sure enough, it is. And in fact, this _layout page is exactly the same as the Razor Pages layout page. It has the same render body. It has the same style sheets up top and the same view data title at the top. And it has the same navigation as well. So it's all the same. It uses the same ASP- helpers in here. This is almost identical. In fact, it is identical in this spot with Razor Pages. So by this time, you're probably wondering, well, that's great, but why do we have two different web application types if they're practically identical? And that's an excellent question. And the answer is tricky. So in general, MVC is here because of a couple reasons. First of all, MVC came out first. Razor Pages wasn't a thing until .NET Core. Before that, we had ASP.NET MVC, and that was our separation of concerns web application type. And it was something that was a big step up from web forms, which, like I talked about before, was stateful, and they had some other problems as well. And they definitely didn't have separation of concerns. It was much more like a WinForm application on the web. So MVC was a big step up. But when Microsoft went to .NET Core and they reimagined how the web would work, one of the things they came up with is, why do we have some complexity here when we don't need it necessarily all the time? So these controllers, these can be quite complex and have a lot of different methods to support multiple pages. Notice the privacy page here supports this, or privacy action supports this privacy view. So it's a different page under home. And that cross-linking and the idea that we have all these different controllers, and this is just the gets right now. We also have puts, posts, and deletes to support as well inside this controller. Controllers could get huge. And they get complex because they're controlling multiple pages. And what happens is it can get, well, complex. And so Microsoft said, sometimes you just want a page. And you just want that page to have data, and you just want it to be simple and not have to go through all this complexity for what might be, a more complex website. And so they came up with Razor Pages. And I think, as you can see, there's a lot of sense in that. The idea that it's one page and it's kind of just to support itself. Now, there's still a benefit to MVC. I would recommend that if you are starting out in web development or are starting out building a web application, start with Razor Pages. As you've seen, this structure, these pages, the configuration, it's practically the same or the same as what we have in Razor Pages. So if you wanted to build a Razor Pages app and then you said, you know what, I need some MVC goodness for some reason, no problem. You can add in MVC with practically no effort. In fact, when we add it in authentication, even if you have a Razor Pages application, it uses MVC to do that. because MVC and Razor pages can mix together no problem. So I would start off simple, but if you need the added complexity, you can go to MVC. This MVC controller, one of the things it really excels at is supporting a single page application. A single page application typically is one where the front end or parts of the front end are written in JavaScript, because JavaScript runs on the client side and you don't have to do that full page refresh every time you change data. It can store data between calls and yet not be stateful on the server side and things like that. So frameworks like Angular or Vue or React, these are single page application type programs or type frameworks. And so you can mix these into ASP.NET MVC in a way where you have your C# code controller on the back end, but the front end, instead of just being a page that gets refreshed every time you change something, this page could actually support or send that JavaScript single page application, or in the near future, a Blazor application, which is a C# single page application on the client side. Application, and just like before, it's exactly the same. How it looks, how it works. You keep going to different pages. That's fine. Notice if I go to privacy, the URL is actually /home/privacy. That's because the route is not implied like it is with this one. We're using the default route here. The default route is /home/index, which just so happens to be the same exact page. Just makes for a nicer URL if you don't have /home/index for your home page. So let's go ahead and add in our own page in order to have our message wall. So I'm going to do it in the home controller. If I wanted to have a different controller name, so right now everything's under home, but if I wanted to group things under maybe person, so person controller, so everything to do with person, add, edit, update, list, all those things under the person controller, I could do that. But in this case, I don't have all that stuff. I'm not sure it makes sense to create a whole new controller. I could create a controller right off of home. I could create an action off of home and then put it in the action folder. But I will, I think, create a new controller just so I can show you how to do it. So a new controller, and we have a few options here. So we have an empty controller, which is nothing in it. We have an MVC controller with read-write actions. That's going to create a whole action list based upon reading and writing. So it's going to have a create, read, update, delete, and list actions. That can be kind of helpful, especially if you're first starting out, because it gives you an example of how to do all of those things. Then we have an MVC controller with views using Entity Framework. If you're using that, I personally do not prefer Entity Framework, so I don't necessarily do that very often. And then we have 3 down here for API. And earlier I said that API stands for Application Programming Interface. The idea behind an API is that it is, at least I call it, a user interface. It really is a user interface. It's just that the user isn't necessarily a person. An API is designed to talk to another application. And so they are excellent for middle tier type applications, because what can happen is, let's say you have a mobile app. That mobile app has to get data from your database. You probably don't want to put direct source code in there to talk directly to your database, and you might not even be able to. Whereas you can have it talk to an API. And an API is a web application that you can send data to and get data from. And it just sends and receives data. There's not really a visual user interface to it. You can run it visually, but it's just a list of data. And so it's used to talk to other applications. Really powerful stuff. And MVC, Razor Pages, they're designed to also integrate APIs in at the same time. So we're going to start off with, let's start with the read-write actions, just so you can see them. Okay, the controller name, let's call this the message wall controller. And this is going to scaffold out our controller with a whole bunch of actions for us. We're not going to use all these actions, and I will delete them probably, but I want to show you all the various things you could do, and then show you the fact that you can do this too and have an example. If I'm building out an MVC application, sometimes I'll even create one of these examples as a controller I'm not going to use, but that way I can have just this look to it. So I can say, okay, this is what I need to do for a delete action post. Okay, so what this creates for us is an index, which that's kind of like the main page of this section. Remember, the index is one of our defaults. So if you say your URL / message wall without giving it an action, just the controller name, it will default to the index action. So you really need to have an index action. Then details, it shows you, notice the URL. So message wall / details / 5. So if you were looking for details on a specific record, you could pass in the ID. It would capture that, and then you could return the view for just that specific details record. Create, that's for creating. So that's the page for viewing the create. That's the get for viewing the create. And then here is the post. Notice it's marked as HTTP post. And that's where we save the value. And so right now it's taking an iForms collection. We'd probably do something different there, like an actual object. But this allows you to take the data in, actually save it somewhere. And notice right here, this is something we did not do in Razor Pages. But the validate anti-forgery token is, what happens is when you have that form tag on your form, on your HTML form, it puts in a hidden field for validating that this is a valid form. So when you post the data, it basically just posts that hidden value back to your server. And it makes sure that the person who's calling the post for create actually loaded up that page and posted it through the page we created. Otherwise, what could happen is somebody else could create their own form like yours and post to your controller and potentially give you bad data or other things. So this is a protection measure. In MVC, we have to specify it. If you don't specify it, it will not validate the anti-forgery token. In Razor Pages, it is validated by default. And you don't have to specify anything. It just happens. All right, so again, edit. This would be the get page where you view the record to edit and you pass in the ID of what to edit. And the actual edit, which is the post where you're sending the data back, you'd send back the ID and the form. Same thing for delete, viewing it and actually deleting it. And those are our examples. Right now we don't have all of them wired up. So let's wire up just the index page. And this is really cool. I really do enjoy this. If we right click on index and say add view, this is pretty awesome. I said, okay, I'll create a view for you. What kind of view do you want? Do you want it to be empty? Do you want it to be a create view, detail, delete, details, edit, or list view? We're going to create with empty right now, but if you had a model, maybe you're gonna modify a model, you could say, I want this, maybe you're down here on create. I want a create page, and here's the model I'm using. And it would create a create page with all the fields that you need to modify. And in fact, let's do that just to show it. I'm going to create the world's easiest model. In the past, we've done a list of string, but in this case, we're going to do a message model, which it's already public. It's going to have one entry in it, and it's called message, and that's a string. So instead of a list of string, we'll have a class, so we'll have a list of message model. So in our create, we're going to modify as create page. We're going to say add view, and it's going to be a create page, and the model is going to be our message model. We don't want to be a partial view. We do want to reference the script libraries, and we want to use the layout page, which is specified in the view start file instead of specifying a specific one. This is the same process we do for Razor pages. We hit add. Now notice down here in the views, watch what happens. We have a new folder called message wall and a new HTML file, CS HTML file called create. And there's a whole bunch of stuff on this page. So there is a form with the ASP-action of create. There is a validation summary, and there is a group section with a label for message, an input for message, and the validation for message box. And then we have a form group for our submit button as well as a link that says back to lists, which goes back to the index page. Notice it's ASP-action, which since it's an action, it's saying, I'm going to assume you know what the controller is because it's the same controller you're in currently. So this will take us back to the index page of the message wall controller, which we don't have one yet, but that's fairly impressive that it creates all that for us. Here's my recommendation for you. If you are going to create a form to populate a model, use the editor to do that for you. Use what I just did, because all of this is now just done for you. And it won't be modified again, meaning it won't get rebuilt at some point. So you can modify this however you want. But this is a great starting point then for your code. So let's create the view or the index controller for our message wall just to have it. So add view, it's going to be empty. We're not going to do anything else. We're going to have it just be empty. Okay, just we have an index page. Let's just say message wall index, like so. And we can even put a link in here, just like this. Let's copy that and paste it down below. And we'll say go to the create. Create a message. Okay, so now let's run this application. We haven't modified the navigation bar yet. We should. We'll get there. So let's just go /message wall. And it says message wall index, create a message. Check that out. That created a form that's nicer than I usually do. And my message is testing 1, 2, 3, and I can hit create, and it goes back to the index. What actually happened here, if we come down to our message wall controller and go to this right here and put breakpoint on our post for the create action. If I come up here and click create, it says form collection, which we expand this out, and we have 2 keys, and one is message and one is that requested verification token. That's the anti-forgery token. So we have a message value. So if we look at collection and look at the values for it, so if we come over here and we were to say collection and ask for message, we would get the value testing 1, 2, 3. So that's wall / create and say, go ahead and create. And he goes, no, you can't do that. The message field is required. That's client-side validation, and it also can be server-side validation. Notice it didn't hit my breakpoint, so this is client-side validation right now. But even if I bypass this and got to my server side, it would still validate against that object and say, no, that's not correct, and I could reject it. So that's really easy to do. I just modify my model to say that's required. And that's the simple stuff, but you can add more validation to an object, and this is just a message, so we won't go too crazy on this, but let's just say string length, and we can specify the maximum length for a string. Let's just say that, for demonstration purposes only, a string cannot be longer than 10 characters. But then I can also say the minimum length is 5 characters. You can see there's other properties here as well that you can add to the object. So now, not only do you have to supply a message, but you also have to supply a message with the correct length. So I'm getting tired of typing this. I'm going to put that link at the top in just a minute. But if I were to say, first I'll create, nope, it's required. How about TE? Notice it says the field message must be a string of a minimum length of 5 and a maximum length of 10. So STS, now it's valid, but if I keep typing, R, good, I can't type any more than, I physically can't type anymore. Like it stopped me. It says, nope, that's the top you can hit, you're done. So that validation is really easy to do. This does apply to both Razor pages and to MVC. And this is why when people say, well, a model is a model is a model, correct? So if you have a model in your library, why do you recreate it in your front end? Why do you even have a folder called models? Just put them on your class library. Well, no, because this is user interface specific stuff. And so this is just for my user interface. And I can even put messages in here to override the message you saw, the error message you saw, with a better one if I thought I had a better one. So that is all definitely user interface stuff. And that's why we have models that look very, very similar or even almost the same in different levels of our application. And not only is it okay, it's actually encouraged. One other thing that can be useful is not just is it for validation, but that message, maybe that's not what I want to show the user. Remember it used the label message, and before we had first name and last name and they were kind of crunched together. That's how we had the property name. We can change that. We can say, well, actually, the display, the name equals, and give it a better name. Really cool message. So when you display this property, the label should say really cool message. But that's the property we're talking about. So now if I run this, and I didn't add in my link yet, and I should do that. We'll do that next. But if I say /message wall, create, it says really cool message. Is that a great title for a field? No. No, it's not. But you can say first space name instead of first name all crunched together. That's pretty cool. So, or you can say given name instead of first name, because maybe that area you're working with, given name is the more common way of referring to a person's first name. Okay, let's go back and add in, before I forget, the link. So layout page, we have links for privacy and links for home. Let's paste in a new one. We're going to call, the action is going to be create, and the controller is message wall. Notice it's two steps here, controller and action. And that's create message, we'll call it. And now we run this, we can go right to that message location by just clicking the link in the header to create message. Boom, there we go. Okay, so that takes care of navigation. It's a little different than Razor Pages, but at the end of the day, it's two items, controller and action, versus just the page. Now let's move on to something I didn't cover in Razor Pages, but I said we would cover eventually, and that is the idea of authentication. So right now, if we run this again, just so you can see it, there is no authentication, meaning you can't log in to your application. There's home, create, message, and privacy, nothing else to the right. There's no way of saying, here is who I am. We're going to change that. So let's right-click on MVC message wall and say add new scaffolded item. And this is going to allow us to add a number of different items, but one of them is identity. So we're going to hit add on this. And this, what it's going to do is going to allow us to add a bunch of different information. But in general, we can just use all the defaults. So the first question is select an existing layout page or specify a new one. Leave empty to set the razor_view start file. Yes, that's essentially the same thing we do for every other page, which is which layout page do you want? Don't specify one, use the view start file. Next, it says, do you want to override these files? So with authentication comes a number of different web pages. If you think about it, it seems simple at first. You got a login page, right? Well, no, there's more than that. Because, and there's the external login, there's an internal login, which is just login, there's a log out page, there's a forgot password page, a confirm email page, an access denied page, a confirm email change page, a status message, all these different pages. And so what Microsoft has done is essentially they've put all these pages in a DLL and said, you don't have to know about any of these. We'll just provide all of them. They're standard. They just work. However, if you decide that you want a different design for your pages, maybe you want to have an extra field, or maybe you want to have a different warning message, or those types of things, you can override the page that Microsoft provides. We will do that with just one page, the login page. So I'll check that box. Otherwise, we'll leave the rest alone. Let's do register, so we have two. But that way, we don't have to modify everything, but we can show what it looks like to modify just two. Now, a data context class. We're going to get into a little bit of data access here, which we're covering in the next course. But what this is doing is it's creating an entity framework data context, which will allow us to access a database and also create a database in a way that is pretty much hands-off. Now, if you're not familiar with entity framework, there's a little bit of what I call magic here. The concept behind entity framework, and typically ORMs in general, or object relational mappers, is that we don't really think about the database. We just ask for information and it's given to us, which is excellent until it breaks. And then we have problems. And so that's when we have to go in and figure out why our code isn't working. And that's where, if you haven't written the code yourself, because Entity Framework generates code for us, if you haven't written it yourself, it can be quite confusing. And if you're already having a problem trying to figure out what code does before figuring out why it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, can be frustrating. So I don't typically advocate Entity Framework. In this case, it's baked right in. And not only that, it's something that comes directly from Microsoft and is supported directly by Microsoft. And it has a ton of experience behind it. So people have built these identity systems a lot. And so the exact same code is getting created over and over and over again. It's not like it's your custom database and it's your custom situation. This is the same database over and over again with the same tables and the same way of doing things. So we're going to leave it using Entity Framework and just let it go as it is. So you have to provide two values. First of all, the data context class, which we hit the plus button to create a new context. And I'm going to leave it as it is, which is the MVC message wall.models.mvc message wall context. That's fine. And that's going to ask us, do you want to use SQLite instead of SQL Server? The benefit here is SQLite is a self-contained DLL style database so that you can deploy everything to a web server instead of having to deploy to a database server and a web server. So that's a possibility if you want to do it that way. We're going to leave it at SQL Server because in general, SQL Server is already installed on your machine for development. It's going to use a local DB, it's called, which is actually just a file. And this shouldn't be a problem on your machine. If you want to try out SQLite, go for it. You won't see much difference either way. And finally, we create a user class, which again, we're going to hit the plus button to generate an MVC message wall user. That's fine. And now we've configured our add identity screen. We can hit add. And it's going to scaffold out the items for us that we need. And it's going to add a new section for us for the identity. This takes a couple of seconds as it builds everything out. It used to crash on us with an older version of Visual Studio, but I think now it has pretty much solidified how it works. There we go. So you got a README file of all the things you need to do to set up your application now that you've added identity. And this is really helpful because it walks you through all the steps you need to get going. First of all, it says that the identity information is in the areas/identity. So if you go to areas folder, which is new, we now have identity, we have data, we have pages. Notice that in here under account, we have login and register. Those are the two pages we said we wanted to override. So that's what it added for us, and a whole bunch of other files as well, and that's all the identity information. But then it says, hey, there's a few things you need to do to configure your application to work with identity. The first one is make sure that you support static files. So look for the app.useStatic files in the configure method, which the one little tweak I wish they would change in this is tell you where is your configure method, and it happens to be in startup, the startup file. So under configure, make sure that you have app.useStatic files, which we do. So that's the first one. It says now to use identity, you also need to enable authentication. You need to have app.useAuthentication in the configure method after static files. Well, use authorization. Was it authorization or authentication? It says authentication. So I copy that and make sure it's not somewhere else. But since it's not, after use static files, we can use authentication. So we copy and paste that. Now, the generated UI requires MVC, which we're an MVC project. So make sure that your application calls services.addMVC from the configure services method. Well, configure services is right here. We don't have that line, but we do have add controllers with views, which should take care of that line. But let's just make sure by seeing if we can add that line. And we can't, it doesn't seem to yell at us. We'll see if there's a problem. I don't think it is. And so next we say call app.useRouting at the top of your configure method. Well, at the top of our configure method, app.useRouting, like so. Okay, got that. And then finally, the generated database code requires Entity Framework Core migrations. So what's going to happen is right now we don't have a database. We're going to need a database. And in fact, if we go to appsettings.json, we should now see connection strings for a database. And that database is going to be called MVC message wall, which we don't have that yet. We didn't create that. So how do we create that? Well, right here it says you're going to generate that. So from Visual Studio Package Manager console or from the command prompt. So let's go to Package Manager console, which happens to be open right here. You can find this under the View menu. So if you go to View and look for Package Management Console, we can first copy this line and run it. And it's going to say build failed. Let's try this again. Build solution, build failed. So I think these directions have steered us just a bit off course. Now, they'll probably update them at some point soon, but I think pages.add razor pages, which we need to have. And they also have some 1 or 2 different packages. But let's start there and see if the build succeeds. And it does not. And it says the type or namespace entity framework core does not exist in the namespace ASP.NET Core identity. Let's go there, double click on it. And it says, hey, that's a problem. But now it's saying I can't find identity.entity framework core. Call it right. Oops, entity framework core. There we go. This is just middleware for error pages. I don't think this is it, but it's not going to hurt to install it. And sometimes this is what you have to do when you have these quirky problems. Now, it used to be, and wow, it just took away that error. It used to be that to add identity, you had to do a whole lot of this and then copy and paste code as well. This has gotten better, and it should be to the point where you don't have to do any of this tweaking. But just in case you do, open up a new instance of Visual Studio, create a test project that has identity already installed, and just do a quick comparison. Now let's build the solution and see if it works. It seems to be working except for sign-in manager requires 1 argument. All right. And again, it's missing one thing that we had in the other template. At inject, and that is sign-in manager of type MVC message wall user, and that is sign-in manager, like so. And if we save that and build the solution again, that seems to have worked. So there's a couple of quirks still. I am using the pre-release version of .NET Core 3, but it should be, it's the go live version, so it should be the same as what you have. So if you have these quirks, hopefully they fix them by the time you get to them. But now our page at least loads. However, there's no way to log in here. So what are we going to do with that? Well, if we go to our layout page, there's one thing to add here to allow ourselves to log in. Let's do it right before our navigation. It's actually going to pull to the right, and it's a partial. Now, a partial is a partial view, and that allows you to have a piece of code you reuse over and over again. We're going to say the name equals underscore login partial. And where is that login partial, and how do I know to do that? Well, that login partial is right here. There's that partial, allows you to sign in or not. That's actually the page that gave us the problems. Now if we run this, we should see the page that allows us to log in. And it's over there and it's crunched. Excellent. That's not what I wanted. But we have register, log in, and the sign-in manager. So register takes us to the register page. Login takes us to the login page. Cool. Now let's make this a little better. So let's close this out. I think the issue here is this wacky thing right there. Let's get rid of that because that's not right. There's something just wrong there. Let's run this again and see if that fixes our problem, or at least makes it a little better. That's much better. Makes me happy. Register or log in. So we can't log in because you have no nothing to log into, and we haven't created an account. We also haven't registered our database. Remember, we had that failed message that took us down this rabbit hole of fixing the authentication, which wasn't too bad to how to fix that. And hopefully by the time, again, you watch this, they've even fixed those quirks. But if not, they're now on video for you to fix yourself. But we don't have a database yet for this. So let's create that first, make sure we have it. If you don't create the database, it will give you a warning message and allow you to create it right from that page, which is really helpful. But if we come back to our scaffolding setup, if we copy this again and go to our package management console and paste it in and run this, this time it should create our migrations for us. And then we come back over here to our scaffolding and copy this update-database, the second command. Come back to our package manager and run this. It will actually create our database for us. This is going to create our entire database, build it, put the tables in, the views, sort procedures, whatever it needs, and set it all up so we can use it. And there it's starting to run the migration. The idea behind Entity Framework is you can migrate over time your changes. So now let's go to a SQL Server Object Explorer. If we go to SQL Server and we look at my local database, we should see MVC message wall is a database. Inside there's a table. Inside there's a users table. If we view the data on that, there's nothing in it, but it's a big table. It's got a lot of stuff as far as columns. Now let's run our application and see if we can't put something in that using our user interface, the website. So register, email address, test, no, you can't do that. Email field is not a valid email address. It's got some validation on it. So how about tim@imtimcorey.com? Yep, that sounds good. Password, pwd12345, period. That satisfies our password requirements. And now I can hit register. When I do so, it says this app does not currently have a real email sender registered. So if you wanted to send out email addresses to validate that, yes, this is a valid email address, then this is the page to do that. But we can click here to confirm our account. And it says, hey, you've hopefully confirmed your account. We can now log in. So tim@imtimcorey.com. I think we can log in. We'll see. pwd12345, period. Don't tell anybody. And I can say log in. And now check it out in the upper right hand corner. We see this. It says, hello, tim@imtimcorey. That's pretty cool. It knows who I am because I'm logged into my website. Even with the pains that shouldn't be there of the template not working quite right, that wasn't hard to do, to add authentication to our website. Now I can hit log out, and I've logged out. If I hit log in, we also have the forgot your password page. We have the register as a new user. adding all those things. We can pretty much ignore those, again, until something breaks, in which case now you got to figure out how to fix this. But it shouldn't break on just the authorization and authentication system. So we said these 2 pages here, we wanted to, oops, not these. We want to make some modifications to it. So we've got the register and the login. We say, you know, we want to make some modifications. Let's just, for the sake of time, just modify the register page. And by the way, if I decide, you know what, I don't want to modify a login page, I can right-click and delete. And say, yep. And it's gone, but I can still log in because that just deletes the override. It's kind of like inheritance in object-oriented programming, where we are overriding the parent's values with our own values. Well, this is overriding the parent's view with our own view. So in this case, we're going to put, let's put an H6 up here. That is, let's have a span with a class that equals, is there a text dash danger? There is. Cool. Danger's red. And so I can put in here, please do not create more than 1 account. I guess is a great message to put. I don't know. That'll be right underneath the create a new account message before the form. So now if we run this and look at the register page, we should see our own message. So register, and there we go. Please do not create more than 1 account. So you can configure this page or lay it out differently, change, maybe this should be a horizontal form instead of a vertical form, or maybe you want to add a checkbox here to confirm that you agree to the terms and conditions. You can do all of that stuff by modifying Microsoft's default page, or you can leave it alone and let it be configured the default way. Notice this page, it's got a CS.html page, and right behind it, a CS.html.cs code. And this is called register model. And we have at page, and the model is register model. This is a Razor page. So we've integrated Razor pages into our MVC application just by using them. We said use Razor pages in our configuration, and then we just started using them. So it's also that easy to add our own as well. That's pretty much it for a really high level, little fast, but at the same time, pretty comprehensive overview of ASP.NET MVC and how to work with it. And also at the same time, some more information on how to work with Razor pages. We can add identity to Razor pages just like we did with this MVC project. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. Let's go to our pro tip for today, which is that ASP.NET Core MVC is best used for larger structures or single page applications. That's kind of its sweet spot right now for building applications. That is not to say that you can't use MVC for other things. If you want a small application, you want to build an MVC, you can do that. And it's not going to be horrible. It's going to be great. It's going to work just fine. And if you want to try to support a larger structure on Razor pages, that actually works out really well too. And SPAs, maybe not quite as much, but it might still be fine. Okay? So don't get caught up in this is the only time to use an MVC project, or this is the only time to use a Razor Pages project. Be a little flexible and realize that there's a lot of overlap here, and you choose which one you feel works best for your situation and be confident in it. Okay? So that's my pro tip for today. Your homework: build a core MVC application that has a simple data entry page with a first and a last name field, and have the button say, "Hi, Tim Corey," when you press it. So it's going to put it somewhere on the page, It's just going to say, hi, Tim Corey, or hi, first name, last name, whatever it is, whenever you press the button. Same homework as with the Razor Pages application, and you'll find that the code is pretty similar. Okay? So give that a shot, either right in the home controller or maybe in a new controller. It's up to you. Once you're done with that, come on back for the next lesson where we're going to tackle a mini project with MVC.